Good morning, everyone. What I've got here is a paper address book. This seems like a good opportunity to talk about privacy. A paper address book like this one is what my parents or pretty much everyone's grandparents would have used to keep track of the people that they know and how to get in touch with them. So let's go ahead and open this up, see what we have here, and then let's try to compare this to how we would do this today and see whether anything of value was lost in the process. So unboxing. Unwrapping. Get some crinkle plastic. I don't think historically anybody ever would have paid $9 for this thing. I think this is sort of a $2 thing back the last time someone would have bought one of these intentionally. But this is what I get for getting obsolete technology. So if we go ahead and look inside, what we have is tabs on the side here with letters, and then the idea is if you want to find someone, you go to the letter for their name, and then for each person we have space for name, address, phone number, and you can see this is modern because it's talking about mobile phone and email, which wouldn't necessarily have been in a traditional one of these, but this is still something that we could potentially use today. If you wanted to track your contacts using a paper book, you could do it. There's also some other stuff in here if you look closely. At the front we have no, we don't actually have the traditional pages that I would have expected. So in a traditional one of these, oh, we get a little pocket for keeping things. That's cool. But the thing that we're missing that I expected to see in this is the thing at the front for emergency numbers, which isn't super critical. This accomplishes the task intended by it. This accomplishes the task that we intend it for. So what we use today instead is usually a cellular telephone. And a cellular telephone has some advantages, but it also has some disadvantages, especially when it comes to the issue of data security or privacy. So some advantages to this thing. We can store hundreds of contacts in this thing. It doesn't break if you drop it. You can drop it pretty far, like throw it out of a second-story window and it wouldn't break. It might get scuffed up, but that's not relevant. If this thing takes moderate damage somehow, like you stab it with a knife or run it over with a car, you're likely to be able to recover most of the data. It's got unlimited battery life. The data is stored directly in the address book. There's no option for remote access. If you leave this at home, you can't get it from somewhere else. And there's no easy way to do backups. You can individually photocopy each page or individually copy the entries by hand into a new book, but mostly wherever this is and whatever condition this is in, that's your data. And you generally wouldn't carry this with you. You wouldn't want to lose it because there's no backup, and it's a little bit bigger than a modern cell phone. Not by much, but it's still like the size of a full cell phone. So carrying both this and a cell phone so that you can make calls without having to store the data in your cell phone, that's probably not what you're going to do. And this was really for the sort of historical situation where you were making calls on your landline telephone and you're writing letters on paper to mail through the post office. Now, the mobile phone, in comparison, can store effectively unlimited phone numbers and contact information. It does have a limit, but even in 1 gigabyte, you're storing thousands of addresses. If this thing gets damaged, it probably won't work anymore. And you definitely don't want to drop it out of a first floor window even. You don't want to knock it off a table. It'll probably still work, but it'll probably crack the screen. Now, the data in this thing tends to be backed up onto a remote server somewhere in the cloud. And the details of that have some trade-offs, but the sort of obvious reason that you're doing it is that if this gets lost or damaged, your data isn't lost or damaged as long as you have it backed up that way. And then if you get another device, it's going to magically get restored. And even further, generally, this is going to be automatically synced with other devices that you need to be able to contact people with. If you have someone's email address in this thing, you can send them email from here, but also you probably can send email to that same contact with the same contact data on a computer. So how does this compare privacy-wise? And in order to figure out how this is going to compare privacy-wise, we're going to have to think about what are the threats? Who is going to try to break our privacy? And what is the concept of privacy that we care about here? And for this particular application, where the thing that we're dealing with is addresses and phone numbers and names of people that we know, the thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to keep that information secret from people who don't need to know. We want to make sure that if anybody wants to know who our friends are and how to get in touch with them, who the people we know are and how to get in touch with them, they have to sort of get our permission. They should need to ask us. And it's important to keep in mind that privacy is really a security property, especially in this situation. Now that's true both in the sense of computer security, where we want to think about things in a whole bunch of different ways, both in the sense of computer security, where we want to think about things in a whole bunch of specific ways, where we want to make it impossible for our security to be violated. We want to build the system so that it's secure by design. And also in the sense that in extreme cases of privacy failure, this can be legitimately dangerous, a risk to your physical personal security. And that's, of course, only in extreme cases, but in extreme cases, it matters. If it finds out, the most extreme case is if you're friends with somebody that the national government doesn't like, you'd rather have the national government not know that you're friends with them. And so that's a security property that we'd like to maintain. We'd like our address book to be secret unless we choose to share it. All right, so let's go ahead and consider some different scenarios that might violate our privacy here. First thing is, let's assume that you live with your, kid brother. So we have your kid brother, and he wants to violate your privacy. And specifically what his plan is there's a friend of yours, and he wants to prank call them. So in order to prank call your friend, your kid brother is going to have to get access to your address book so they can find out what your friend's phone number is. Now, with a paper address book, your kid brother is going to have to find it, so you could secure it from that problem by hiding it somewhere. Normally, hiding stuff isn't the greatest security mechanism, but this isn't the most significant threat, and hiding a physical address book works pretty well against this sort of threat. The other thing that you could do is just lock this in a desk drawer, and that's the common level of security that was used with this. If you had information in paper form that you didn't want someone to have access to, you would lock it with a key, and then people who don't have the physical key aren't going to get access to your stuff unless they want to bust open your desk drawer, and probably your kid brother isn't going to go to that sort of extreme in order to get access to your data. Now, in contrast, if your kid brother wants to get access to data that's on your mobile phone, he again needs to get access to your phone, but you're more likely to leave your phone lying around by mistake. The traditional way to avoid this problem, if your kid brother can get access to your unlocked phone, then he has access to your friend's phone number. But if you use a screen lock mechanism, set a PIN so that your phone doesn't unlock without entering the PIN, that by itself mostly solves the problem. And so, minor threat, either of these situations can handle it without too much trouble. But what happens when the kid brother gets a little bit more technically advanced? What if your kid brother is a ninja hacker? Now, or a ninja hacker who knows how to pick locks. So if they can pick locks, then can pick the lock in your desk drawer and get access to your paper address book. So at that point, you're stuck like trying to hide it, which I guess that's fine. But with the phone, there isn't a great way to actually bypass phone screen lock pins. If you try too many times, your phone is going to lock out. And to deal with other attacks, you can consider things like storage encryption, and that comes by default on modern smartphones. So with a PIN and storage encryption, even your kid brother as a hacker isn't going to be able to sort of break into your phone. So the phone is slightly better in that sort of situation. That being said, the phone is subject to risks that the paper book is not subject to. For example, what if your cloud provider is Google? So this is a Google phone then, and all of your contacts are going to get backed up to your Google account. And let's say you have other Google services, for example, Google Music. So you can listen to sort of arbitrary music from the cloud whenever you want to. And you've given your Google password to your brother so that he can access your Google Music account. Now suddenly, this kid brother has access to all of your contacts because they're backed up to your Google account. Your brother just has to log into Gmail, and suddenly he has all of your personal data that was locked on your phone. And there's no way to make that kind of error with a paper address book, so that's an advantage to the old dumb solution. More serious cases are possible. Your kid brother trying to prank your friend isn't life-threatening or critical, but what if your brother is a political extremist and wants to find out if you're in contact with a specific political organizer? You probably don't want that information available at all. What if, instead of your brother, we're talking about your abusive spouse and they want to know who you're talking to? You'd really rather not have that information be available again. And in that sort of case where this is more extreme, your phone tracks another kind of information that's really important to keep in mind, and that is communication history. You have the history of all the calls that you've made on that phone, and also the history of all the messages you've sent and received. So if the information that's available leaks for some reason, for example, because somebody gets access to your password, then significantly more and more dangerous information has leaked. Now, another thing to consider here is what happens if a random stranger steals your phone. And we're going to assume for this scenario that random strangers aren't going to steal your address book because it's sitting at home in your desk drawer. You don't need to carry it with you, and so you're not going to like drop it somewhere. Someone's not going to pick your pocket and get it. And so this is really a phone-only situation. The benefit of having that access to that information all the time from the phone comes with the cost of potentially having the phone get stolen. And again, the same countermeasures that prevented even a technically capable kid brother from accessing your data, screen lock and storage encryption, tend to make random strangers stealing your phone not be a big deal. You just go buy a new phone, restore your backups from the cloud, and you are all set. Now, let's consider our next threat. The next threat is phone app developers. Once you put contacts in your phone, or any other personal data in your phone, you're one click away from sharing that information with the developer of any application that you install on your phone. That's with a modern smartphone like Android or iOS. If Angry Birds wants your contact information, it's going to say, we want to share your high scores with all your friends who also play Angry Birds. Approve this request to access your contact information. As soon as you tap that approve button, just one click, this app developer has access to all your contacts. And the thing that they're probably going to do, the thing that at least they can do, and we're thinking about this from a security perspective, so if they can do it, we're going to go ahead and assume that they do it. The thing that they are going to do right away is copy all of your contacts to their server. And then they can process it later at their leisure, and that's convenient for them in a number of ways. But again, this is a risk for the phone that just isn't a risk at all with the paper address book. So the next question is what happens... The next question is, what are the privacy considerations for the phone vendor themselves? So this phone here, I think this is a phone from OnePlus, and it came with Android on it initially. So there's two vendors here to consider, the hardware vendor OnePlus, and then the operating system vendor Google. And in both of those cases, they have access to the same information that our app vendor had access to. The big difference is that instead of you having to click share this data, you don't have to click share this data. The people who are able to install system applications on your phone have full access to that data regardless of what you do. They can just go ahead and copy that data all they want. And again, we're thinking about this from a security perspective, so we want to go ahead and assume that they are copying that data. And in the case of the operating system vendor, it's sort of one step worse in that the feature that they're providing of backing up your data, where we know for a fact that they back up your contact list to their server so that if you get a new device, they can restore it, or so they can sync between multiple devices. And so it's not that they could copy the data, it's that we know that they do copy the data. From a security perspective, that's not really that different. We should assume that people are doing things that they can do that we don't necessarily want them to, but we know that they have the data. Now, some phone vendors, some phone operating system vendors are going to say that backup and synchronization data is encrypted and that they don't have access to it, but that's not some technical constraint that we can rely on. We have no way of even verifying that. We don't know what their servers are doing. So all we can do is, well, we should assume that since they can change things to decrypt that sort of thing, we shouldn't rely on it at all. But further than that, they can change that policy at any time. And even if the encrypted data on their server right now is inaccessible to them, they can copy the encryption keys from your device back to their server, or they can make another unencrypted backup whenever they want to, just by pushing an update or otherwise taking advantage of the fact that they control both the software running on the device and the synchronization mechanism. So for an app developer, you have to click that you want to share the data. For the phone manufacturer and the operating system vendor, you don't have to click anything. They just have access to all of the data on your device. So the next question is, what about law enforcement? If the police want to get access to your contact information for some reason, can they do that? So in the case of the paper address book, they can. They can go to a judge, they can get a warrant, they can break into your house, they can break into your desk, they can take the data the warrant described. They'll have to have gotten a warrant that specifically says that they want to get your papers so that they can get contact information that you've stored. But if they have that warrant, they are legally allowed to come do that. If you've hidden this really well somehow, they may not find it, but that's not really very strong security unless you put a lot of effort into it. With the phone, it seems like it could be a little bit harder, but it's really not that much harder. So if they have a warrant, they can contact the phone manufacturer, the operating system vendor, and request a copy of the backups. If those backups are encrypted, the law enforcement may end up with encrypted backups, but generally, if the provider can access the data, and they technically can, the court is going to order that they provide an accessible copy of the data, and in the face of a warrant, companies are going to comply with a court order. The more interesting question is what happens when the police don't have a warrant? So in the case of the paper address book, if the police don't have a warrant, they're probably not going to have access to the data. They aren't going to engage in breaking and entering illegally to get access to your stuff unless there's some extreme situation. That's possible, but that's not going to be the common case. In the case of the phone, the answer to that question is just we don't know. If If the police, if your local police send a message to Google saying we don't have a warrant, but we want your data, your local police are probably just going to, Google is probably just going to say no to the local police, and the local police are going to be out of luck. If it's the FBI, we really don't know. There's some cases where famously the FBI complained that Apple wouldn't comply with that sort of request, especially with devices that the FBI had in their custody that had storage encryption. But we're thinking about this from a security perspective. It's not safe to assume that large companies are not going to cooperate with law enforcement. It's in their best interest in general to do that, and there's significant evidence that they have done that in the past and that they're likely to do it again in the future, depending on the details. And that brings us on to our final threat that I want to discuss, and that is sort of national intelligence and national governments in general. And so we do have this threat of what happens if the FBI or the NSA wants to get access to your data. And they realized at a certain point, especially the NSA, they realized that hard drives are now big enough that when we're talking about this sort of textual data, like address book information, there's no technical limit that prevents them from just collecting all of it and keeping it forever. And based on publicly available information that we're pretty sure is accurate, they have put a significant amount of effort into actually doing that. They have had programs that work with companies like cell phone operating system vendors, internet service providers, all sorts of cloud service providers, where they collect the data and then they store it. There have been some arguments about whether it's legal for them to do that. There have been some arguments about whether they can keep the data after doing it. There have been some arguments about when they are legally allowed to access the data that they've collected and for what purpose. But again, we're thinking about this from a security perspective. And so the question isn't, what do they say they're allowed to do right now? The question is, what are they able to do? And from a perspective of what are they able to do, what have we seen them be able to do based on reliable information, the thing to assume is that any data that's ever been in a cloud service is available to the US national government. And if we want to be just slightly more complete in our security mindset of if people can do it, they do it, we want to go ahead and assume that some of that data is available to other national governments as well. So that raises the question, what can you do with a bunch of address books? Because some of the threats that we're considering here, app vendors, operating system vendors, and phone vendors, and then national governments, they aren't getting access to just one address book. They're getting access to a whole collection of address books, millions of address books. The majority of people, I think, are putting like useful portions of their personal address book into cell phones, and cell phones that do the cloud backup mechanism. So national governments have hundreds of millions or billions of these address books, and even if Angry Birds is really collecting contact information, I don't know if they actually are, but lots of apps do. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of address books, even for a moderate-sized mobile app. So one thing that gets you, once you have that data, is that you get a searchable social graph. And a searchable social graph is a pretty powerful tool to have for a bunch of things, from coordinating public relations to finding people that you don't like for some reason. So one of the scariest phrases from the United States in the mid-20th century was, "Are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" In the 1950s, when that question was actually asked by the government, by employers, Answering yes wasn't necessarily life-threatening, but a lot of people did lose out on jobs or get fired and then blacklisted, and then have trouble making a living in their chosen career as a result of the answer that they gave to that question. And it's important to keep in mind that the United States Communist Party was really unpopular in the 1950s, but back in the 1920s and the 1930s, it wasn't unpopular. It was something that sort of young, progressive type people were involved in. You could think of it sort of as a more popular version of what the United States Green Party is today. So that raises the question, do you have any people in your address book who have ever participated in a political protest? And if people get really interested in that question in the future, in 5 or 10 years, they're probably not going to have to ask you about it.